The Author Meets the Critics. Welcome to The Author Meets the Critics, where best-selling authors and their severest critics, the nation's top book reviewers, meet each other in a literary free-for-all. Informal, unrehearsed, catch-as-catch-can. And now meet the man who keeps the peace on these programs, your regular chairman, John K.M. McCaffrey.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our author today is one of America's most popular and widely read biographers, Irving Stone. You will, of course, remember his portrait of Vincent van Gogh, Lust for Life. Other Irving Stone books include Clarence Darrow for the Defense and Sailor on Horseback, which was a life of Jack London, and perhaps the most popular of the Stone biographies was his latest, Immortal Wife. The book to be discussed today is Irving Stone's newest, published on Friday. It's called Adversary In The House, and it's a novel based on the life of Eugene V. Debs. Here to discuss Adversary In The House, pro and con, are Norman Thomas and Charles G. Paulding. But before the author meets his critics, here is a short synopsis of the book under discussion from the author himself, Mr. Irving Stone.
Well, Mr. McCaffrey, I almost wish you were right in calling me a biographer. I'd be slightly happier today, perhaps, because over the weekend I've taken some inky thrashings from some of the critics who wish I had written this book as straight biography rather than as biographical novel. They seem to feel that if I had a biography with thousands of footnotes, which the college professors could point to, I'd be much better off and have written a more authentic book. But I don't want a biography because I don't believe enough people read biographies. I don't want my books to sit up on library shelves. I want them to be live and dramatic and exciting. I want everybody in the world to read them. You know that is the fundamental wish of authors. And so I write what's called a biographical novel, in which all of the material that I can possibly make authentic is true and sticks to the facts. But I try something else. Instead of achieving a factual conviction in the minds of people, I try to achieve an emotional conviction. Because I believe that once people are convinced emotionally, they will never forget the experience or the book or what that book has to say. Another reason for making this book emotional is that the hero, Eugene V. Debs, was a very emotional man indeed. In fact, because of his emotion, he began and ended his life and his professional career in the penitentiary. His first crime in 1894 was that he believed all people working inside an industry should belong to one union. For that, he got 6 months in the Woodstock prison. Toward the end of his life in 1919 to 1920, he was sent to Atlanta Penitentiary because he believed that if no human being would kill any other human being, there could be no more wars. That was not the right thing to say during that war, and so he was sent to the penitentiary.
Aren't you leaving out one very emotional aspect of his life, Mr. Stone?
Which one is that, Mr. McCaffrey?
Well, you devote considerable time to his wife and to his childhood sweetheart.
Yes, indeed. I don't think that any book is good unless it tells the personal life of a man, because I believe that has a very important influence on him. There's a very strange situation in Eugene V. Debs' life. He had 2 marriages. The first was with his young brother who stood loyally by his side, fought for him through all his life, and said to him, "Gene, no matter whether you're right or wrong or what happens to you, I'll always stand by you and fight for you." But his wife, Kate, took exactly the other position. She was a woman who worshipped the social values and the economic values. Gene worshipped only justice and humanity. And so his wife, Kate, opposed all of his ideas, all of his beliefs, and all of his causes. She loved him, but she said, "I think you're wrong, and what's wrong with our marriage is that I don't agree with you."
In other words, she was the adversary in the House, as Mr. Debs was the adversary in the House for the United States for quite some time. But I'll bring on your critics, Mr. Stone. Here they are. First, the managing editor of Commonweal magazine, Mr. Charles G. Paulding.
I'm entirely willing to trust Mr. Stone's research, and consequently willing to believe that Mr. Debs was afflicted with an awful, an impossible, a neurotic, a stupid wife, to whom he felt obliged, because he was honest and he loved her, in his way, to explain. He felt obliged to explain all the time why he believed in labor unions and in socialism, in earnest pronouncements taken perhaps from his writing and speeches. But when you put those endless conversations and those appalling conversations with his brother, my dear Pod, as he calls him, into a novel, you get what the book trade calls a juvenile, a juvie, a book for children. It's like when Horatio Alger explains the virtue of honesty to his little bootblacks. It's all true, it's all simple, and it's all pretty tedious preaching. Kate, Debs' wife, is the adversary in the house, but she's also the major adversary in Mr. Stone's novel.
There, Mr. Stone, is the opposition. Now, on the other side of the fence, with a different opinion of adversary in the House, is the Socialist Party leader of the United States, a man who knew Eugene V. Debs very well, Mr. Norman Thomas.
In my judgment, Adversary in the House, if it were a novel, and only a novel, should be highly praised and widely read. It is a definite addition to American literature, and comes at a time when my own opinion of the current crop of fiction is low. But then maybe I'm a very poor critic, because I don't think the book sounds like Horatio Alger, and I do think that a little Horatio Alger even might improve some books that I've seen. And I do suspect, by the way, that Gene called his brother Pard. He was the kind of man who would do the things that sound a little corny on Fifth Avenue. But to me, the importance of the book lies in the fact that the principal character, most of all Gene Debs himself, are real people, honestly presented. And that goes, I think, for Kate. This book will go a long ways to making Gene Debs the living force that he ought to be in a world which sorely needs his combination of love of individual people with high devotion to a cause. I've already learned by experience that some readers may expect the book to be what it is not. It is not a complete and detailed biography of Gene Debs, or a history of his life and times, or a philosophical appraisal of socialism and other movements. It is a biographical novel, an obvious labor of love by an author who has made himself peculiarly a master in this field. Frankly, I praise it as a novel, but I hope from it a great increase in the understanding of a very noble American, whose living influence I covet for the world today.
Well, gentlemen, I think that the lines are very clearly drawn here. I'd like to put another line under that clearly drawn line, and to come to this question of biography, or the fictionalized biography as Mr. Stone presents it. In today's New York Times, Mr. Lloyd Lewis, a distinguished biographer in his own right, begins his review of Adversary in the House by saying this: "Lives of great men all remind Irving Stone that he can make their lives sublime by turning them into fiction, and departing thus leave no footnotes in the sands of time." Mr. Lewis is a little bit bitter, and he goes on at that point to add a couple of footnotes that he wishes were in the book. And one of the important, and it seems to me central things that he says is that this concept of Mrs. Debs perhaps may not be true, that we have more fiction than biography. And he quotes a labor reporter, an old-time labor reporter, who told Lloyd Lewis that this woman was not as presented in the book. So, how do you feel about such a statement as that, Mr. Paulding?
Well, I hope it isn't true that she was like that. But a novelist, after all, this is a novel, Mr. McCaffrey. Everybody already said 10 times that it wasn't a strict biography of footnotes. And if it's a novel, the author has the right to choose and present his characters in order to bring out the main character. Now, I think that I can't believe that any human being with a life like Debs is, an earnest, fighting life, could conceivably have spent as much time trying to explain to his wife, as I said, what he was doing. It seems to me absolutely incredible, and it makes the book, the conversations in there, the endless conversations, are only paralleled by Mr. Stone's extraordinary invention of finding out that Debs always remembered his early railroad days, and he has a literary trick in the beginning of the book. He says, clackety-clack, clackety-clack, click-clack, click-clack, went through Debs's head. Well, it goes through his head at every moment of emotion right straight through the book. And it's really pretty extraordinary, coming to a terrific crisis at the Pullman trial. Now, that's a serious thing, and this is how Debs... I'm trying to defend Debs here. I'm not against Debs. I think he's the most wonderful man. He sits at the Pullman trial and, quote, leaning forward eagerly in his chair, his rich, warm voice sounding a clackety-clack, clackety-clack, click-clack, click-clack over the years. He addressed now the jury, now the judge, etc.
All right, now how do you feel about this onomatopoetic way of presenting Mr. Debs' emotion, Mr. Thomas?
You see, I'm not a literary critic, and maybe that's what's the matter with me, but I found that entirely unobjectionable and indeed quite possible. I can remember things in my own life that written out by a novelist, even at Mr. Stone's stature, would sound something like that, only not so good. Phrases that keep recurring from time to time. I don't think that's at all an improbable thing. As for Kate, I don't know. I can't speak positively. I am not sure that there are many men now living who can speak positively. But I say with considerable regret that from what I do know, and that is something, the character of Kate was very much as Mr. Stone has drawn her. Her actions following Gene Debs' death proved it. And may I say this? I don't feel so unsympathetic as Mr. Paulding about Kate herself. She married Gene expecting something different to happen. It didn't happen, and it somewhat embittered her, but she continued to love Gene. It's a case of two people loving each other but having very different views about life. And I think when that happens and they still love each other, probably both sides made a good many, kitchen or bedroom orations to each other. Knowing
well,
Gene,
let's say
I
kitchen
think it's
and
quite
bedroom.
likely.
Excuse me, but I don't think, Mr. Thomas, you can draw down that disliking each other quite so simply as that. After all, she disappointed Debs in his greatest desire of his life, and that was to have children. That's why he married her. I think that's pretty serious.
Well, I think, Mr. Paulding and Mr. Thomas, that we ought to bring on another witness.
But even
now.
that disappointment was partly because she didn't like the direction of his life and the kind of home in which her children would grow up.
Well, I'd like to hear the comments of our author of the afternoon on this obstetrical dilemma, and to bring on Mr. Irving Stone, author of Adversary in the House. Mr. Stone.
I might say, Mr. McCaffrey, that your author's been writhing over here on his chair, though it's been an interesting experience for me to have two other men fighting over one of my books while I have to sit by quietly and listen. As far as I can analyze Mr. Paulding's objections to the book, first of all, the dialogue seems endless. I'm sorry if that's true, but these dialogues between people have got to go to a point where full understanding is expressed and the full emotion is thrashed out. I think that's true in every marriage. I know it's certainly true in my own. As far as the Horatioalgia concept is concerned, maybe that's true, but then Gene Debs came from a poor family that operated a small grocery store, and he could have become a very great and rich man. He might have gone into the White House, but he took Horatioalgia in reverse. He refused to take money. He refused to go into business. He refused to take advantage from any movement on the face of the earth. All he wanted to do was to help the working people get more money, better working conditions, to have a finer voice in the life of the people about them. Mr. Paulding, I'm a little afraid that you don't like novels. Am I right about that?
Oh, I think you're very wrong, Mr. Stone. I hate to contradict you. I haven't finished anywhere near saying what I don't like about yours.
Oh.
Go ahead, Mr. Paulding.
I'd like to just say one thing, because after all, I have accused it of being horribly oversimplified. I'd like to ask Mr. Stone one question. That is, this conversation, am I right in suspecting that it does come, is it the result of very hard work in getting it out of his speeches and writings? Because that would explain the rather stilted tone it gives me. I can't believe that he talked that way. You see, when you get one of his really fine quotes, you end up the book with a magnificent quote, while a man is still not free, I can't be free. Then it rings out. It's like hearing a line of Shakespeare that you know. But when speeches are not writing, and it's impossible if you do quote, as I think you legitimately probably did, a great deal of his writings in direct discourse, that may be the explanation for the horribly wooden character of the language.
Well, I'd like to explain that, Mr. Paulding. I put in 3 years on this book, 2 of them in research, and 1 of them in writing with Spot Research Abbott. I spent a very long time in Terre Haute, Indiana, with Theodore Debs and Theodore's wife and daughter. I spent time with many of Gene Debs' nieces and nephews. I spent time all over the face of America with his associates from labor and from the socialism group. I spent it with men who were bankers and businessmen and preachers and lawyers who loved Gene Debs like they've never loved any man perhaps in America since Abraham Lincoln. These men reported to me literally thousands of pages of dialogue, all of which I recorded. From this dialogue, from what I understood of Gene Debs, and from the intimate family things given me by his family, I tried to work out what I thought was the way Gene Debs talked. No novelist can work any other way, Mr. Paulding.
Yes, but every novelist has to create some kind of rhythm of conversation in these days. Otherwise, it is a verbatim thing, and no verbatim thing's of any interest, I think.
Now, Mr. Thomas, what about you? You, after all, must have heard Debs speak a lot, both informally and on a platform.
I wish I'd heard him speak more informally. I knew him well only in the latter years of his life. But my impression is that that's an entirely credible type of conversation. And you see, I don't even think it's so bad. I read it with lots of interest. Maybe that's because I'm so interested in the subject, but maybe not. When you're interested in the subject, sometimes you're bored and want more repetition of it.
Well, what about the whole, Mr. Paulding?
Excuse me, one more thing. Mr. Thomas, couldn't we make a compromise on this instead of squabbling and accept it as an excellent tract? How about that? A nice paper pamphlet.
No, we'll not accept that compromise.
I can't do that because in the tract business, I would have put in something else and some more. You see, I think that it is an excellent biographical novel, and I emphasize biographical and I emphasize novel. It is a unique field, a field that Mr. Stone has made peculiarly his own. It's a field that has pitfalls. You can criticize people for ever writing biographical novels. But once you accept it, I think this is a mighty good example of it. And incidentally, you don't know how I feel like getting up and giving 3 cheers because I'm listening now to a strictly literary critic who prefaces what he says by saying, I'm a great admirer of Gene Debs. Now, those of you who aren't literary critics, read the book and see if you don't admire Gene Debs, too, and that's what I care about. I confess I'm not a literary critic. I'm rooting for an admiration of Gene Debs, who too largely is becoming a name bandied about in controversy by different sides, assumed to be great or not great, but somehow a name without much content, stuff of reality. That's why I like this book. If you want to talk to me about fine points of doctrine and even of biography and history, that's another subject. I am saying I like Gene Debs presented in this book because America and the world, at a time when radicals mostly have gone drunk with the concept of power, very much need the picture of that kind of a man that Gene Debs really was.
I'd like to ask Mr. Stone at this point what you consider the implications of this novel, the idea that you got to write a novel on Gene Debs at this time, a man who has been, as Mr. Thomas has indicated, largely vilified on so many hands.
Well, that answer is very simple because taking my lead from what Norman Thomas has just said, we see all around us in the world today governments and movements headed toward what we'll call authoritarian power. Individuals and groups who want to take control of peoples and nations, who want to tell them what to think, how to act, what to do, and how to live their lives. Gene Debs never had any such concept of power. Gene Debs always said, this is going to be a free and open group. Whatever we accomplish by way of reform or social justice, we will accomplish through education, through open meetings, the press, and only when a majority of the American people want what we want will we secure what we want through the open ballot.
But wasn't it true that Debs, as his life went on, continued to become more ideological and less concerned just with the simple problem of labor, which had started him off in his career?
Yes, he met an impasse when he was put in prison in 1894 over that ARU strike. He believed in the latter years that labor must be politically conscious and must learn how to vote because there was no good waging a conflict for its what it figured to be its further rights if it went to the poll and then voted for the opposition. That was like voting against itself.
Mr. Thomas?
I'd like to come in at this point. I don't like the overtones, Mr. McCaffrey, of this ideological or what have you.
I was hoping to give it every overtone I could, Mr. Thomas.
And the way you said it. There is no such thing in the modern world as working effectively for labor with complete indifference to political issues. Gene learned that in that big railway strike when it was, I think, a misuse of political power that ended that particular strike. I challenge anybody to tell me any way of dealing with the problem of prices, with the problem of getting food to Europe, with the problem of preventing another war, without getting into the realm of ideas and into the realm of political action and carrying into that the right spirit. And I, for one, am being very tired of reading in excellent reviews of Mr. Stone's book that, after all, he's not passing on this question or that, and the reviewer... In other words, the reviewer doesn't like to say that Gene Debs was right about the First World War. I like to say that Gene Debs was right about the First World War. That after the First Battle of the Marne, it would have been possible to make a negotiated peace 1,000 times better than the Peace of Versailles, and we would be in far less danger than we are now. We would not have had paradise.
Mr. Thomas,
I'd like to say Gene Debs was right about being a socialist. And go and do likewise, some of it.
It's obvious that I picked the right inflammatory word, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Paulding, would you like to
I
continue?
knew this was going to happen, and that's why I came. I wanted here... I wanted Mr. Thomas to talk about socialism, and I think he's fine. But I have a professional conscience, and I'm being paid here today to try and talk about
Don't let
this
that
book.
get around, Mr. Paulding.
My paper. Now, I want to come back to this thing of the tract. I think that when, after 365 pages, Debs says this, for instance, in just going to bed in the evening after a long day of being received in New York. By the way, that trip in New York is a great disappointment to me, Mr. Stone. You mentioned the forward, the Jewish Daily Forward, and you talked about it just as if to a paper, just to date it or something. You never told how the really rich intellectual quality of that paper, how Abe Kahn had published all the great authors of Europe for years. But that's an incident. At the end of that horrible day, Debs says to Kate, America is made up of hundreds of races, religions, faiths. We have to live together, be good neighbors. If each of us despises our fellow Americans, Kate, how will we ever achieve peace and goodwill? Now, I call that a tract. I agree with it, heaven knows, and it's necessary to say it, but I don't think it makes the novel.
You really mean that no husband ever talked to his wife
No.
as if he was talking a tract? That no wife ever talked to her husband worse than a tract? Do you mean that?
Well, now listen.
Not for very long.
This isn't very long. It didn't take long to say that. You could do it quick getting to bed.
It would take...
Mr. McCaffrey, Mr. Paulding is using a trick which is generally kept for political purposes, and he's using it on a literary program, and that is he's taking excerpts, reading a line or two without giving either the emotion or the situation. I'm not asking you to quote what goes before that, Mr. Paulding, but taking extracts out of a 200,000-word novel and holding one or two sentences up to ridicule is not quite the fair...
Mr. Stone, I can't do anything else. I can't read the whole book through out loud in half an hour, and I've got to give, honestly, some specimens, samples.
Well,
I
would you
give
mind
you my
picking
word
the
that they
best
are
one?
not taken madly out of context. I could take millions of them. Here's another one. This is your language, not Mr. Debs' language. Talking about Kate when you first meet her. Her skin arousingly smooth to the touch. Subtle, warm coloring spread with the artistry of a Rubens brush. That sounds to me like an advertisement for the Fuller brush.
Well, I think, Mr. Stone, that you would have to say that if Mr. Paulding, or in this case were Mr. Thomas, who was reading passages he particularly liked, you wouldn't object to that.
Oh, no, I should like that, but I'm afraid Mr. Paulding would be a little embarrassed. I haven't noticed that he's found any passages that he likes so far.
Yeah, all right, no, that's fair. I'll tell you that both the long passages of Debs when he was in jail were very moving to me. I thought they were good, and I thought that Debs did that, Mr. Stone.
We are humbly grateful, Mr.
Well,
Paulding.
thank you.
Mr. Stone is looking much happier now.
All right, no, I'll just...
I think you're doing very well in a modern novel to find as much as that in the conversation.
If you can let me make one more criticism, because I don't want to have you think that I'm just picking out one or two things to be annoying about. I think the way you bring in at the beginning of the book, Robert Ingersoll, Susan B. Anthony, Jenny Lind, and James Whitcomb Riley, you're bringing in just a lot of little popular pictures of people without going into them at all, no depth at all. Listen to what you say about Ingersoll. After Debs had heard him, his voice rolled out against the divine revelation of the Bible, against the existence of a blazing hell. Gene came to grasp the miracle. Ingersoll's father, in brackets, had been the bow pulling mankind backward. The sun was the quivering arrow. I have to quote those things because that's the only thing I object to in the book. I've tried to make it clear that I like Debs and that I like your ideas about Debs. But I don't like the writing of the book. And there's no other way to do it except to quote things that I think are rather sad.
Could I see you about 18 months from now, Mr. Paulding, when my new manuscript is finished? I think you'd do a magnificent editing job for
I should love to. I was afraid you were going to say, can I see you outside when this is over?
I must say, Mr. Stone, that I saw at least 5 Doubleday editors who were in the house beginning to quiver and bristle when you suggested that anyone would do a better editing job. Oh, yes, or the sling in the arrow, but that's another book.
Well, I think that Mr. Paulding has a right to quarrel with my style. As a matter of fact, when Lust for Life first came out and I went up to Boston, one of the editors of Houghton Mifflin, a publishing house up there, said, I hate to tell this to you, Mr. Stone, but I found your book just a little too lush. And I think perhaps that's what you're objecting to, Mr. Paulding.
Well, Mr. Stone, I've never seen an author who was as nice as you are when he went through after what I've said. That is exactly my criticism, I think. That lushness when you're going yourself and tedium when you're quoting from Mr. Debs, except in his high moments. And once again, I want to repeat that I hope everybody will read this book, as you said in your opening. I hope the whole world will read it, because it does. It is a very fine, pleasant tract about a great man.
I think, however, that Charles Jackson could use that title, A Lush for Life. In any case, Mr. Thomas, do you have any comments on the way the political career, Debs' political career, was handled in this book? Do you feel that justice has been done to the fight, and it was on political terms with which you are very sympathetic that Mr. Stone has given us?
I think that Mr. Stone's done a good job for a biographical novel on the political side. I've tried to say that throughout. If, as some of my friends do, they approach the book looking for a detailed biography or for a careful study, why, no, of course, it isn't that at all. Debs' career stops at the high moment of his release from Atlanta. You can't do that in a biography. You can't do it if you're giving a history of labor and radical movements in the United States. I think you're amply justified in doing it in a novel. And I think that because or in spite of the passages that Mr. Paulding has quoted, a lot of people are going to find it a very moving story, as a novel is a moving story, and will want to know more about that kind of a man. And then they'll have a chance to read other things and other writers. The field ought to be wide open. One of the very interesting facts is this. Many people in the last few years have told me they were going to write something about Debs, or some book in which Debs would figure rather largely. I've had people who said they were going to write plays, biographies, historical studies, novels. This is the only one that's come through, and that interests me. Something has checked all the others. If they've seen the light of day, I've never seen the books. And I'm glad something has seen the light of day. A very distinguished man, whom I'm not at liberty to name, had intended to write a novel in which Gene Debs would loom large. He gave it up. Not because he didn't admire Debs, but because he thought it was so hard a job.
Well, Mr. Stone.
Believe me, Mr. Thomas, it was a hard job. That 3 years was the bitterest and hardest driven 3 years I've ever spent. And if people do read it, I'll feel that the work was rewarded.
Well, I think that if we succeed in our function here on The Author Meets the Critics, not only to entertain, but to provide enough controversy, then people, Mr. Stone, will go out and read it and have an experience with a novel and also an experience with Eugene V. Debs, and we'd like that to happen. Now, here is Bob Sherry to give you a preview of our next book on The Author Meets the Critics.
Next week's author of the afternoon is General Robert W. Johnson, chairman of the board of Johnson & Johnson, who during the war served as vice chairman of the War Production Board and chairman of the Small War Plants Corporation. General Johnson's public statements on worker management problems and the record of the firm he heads have aroused wide interest in both labor and business circles. General Johnson's new book is entitled, Or Forfeit Freedom, and it is a plea for the preservation and improvement of the system of private enterprise. We're looking forward to having General Johnson on our program next week, along with Mr. James Carey, Secretary-Treasurer of the CIO, as guest critic. And now back to Mr. McCaffrey.
Before closing, I'd like to thank Mr. Irving Stone for coming here to discuss his new book, The Adversary in the House, and to thank you, Mr. Norman Thomas, and you, Mr. Charles G. Paulding, for joining us. This is John K. M. McCaffrey saying good afternoon for The Author Meets the Critics.
The Author Meets the Critics is produced by Martin Stone, directed by Bill Patterson. If you'd like to see our show, just write to WNBC for tickets.
This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.